Hi dear students, how are you? I hope you're fine. Today we're gonna have section 4 of psychological methods. So let's start. So we're going to discuss the experimental and ethical issues. Researchers use experiments to answer what? To answer questions about cause and effect. So when I talk about experiments, so I'm talking about cause and effect. When conducting experiments, researchers must consider such things as independent and dependent variables, control groups, and the placebo effect, dependent variables, independent variables. So we are going to discuss all of this now. But remember, experimental, so I'm talking about cause and effect. Psychologists here follow ethical practices and standards when working with people or animals. Don't forget that they have to follow the ethical practices. So experimental and ethical issues. Main idea we're talking about: the experimental method is used by researchers to answer questions about what, very important, cause and effect. In addition, psychologists must consider the ethical issues involved in their experiment. Very important point. I have here some questions that I'm going to discuss. How would you describe the primary purpose of the experimental method? What's the purpose of single and double blind studies? Why do researchers measure central tendency and dispersion? What are the three overriding ethical issues in psychology? Why do scientists sometimes conduct research with animals? Okay. Are all, here I have research and animal rights. Are the rights of animals considered in the research experiments or not? This is very important. Here a researcher conducts a sign recognition experiment with a chimpanzee. Okay, the experimental method. Psychologists use the experimental method to answer questions about what? I have to study this and remember this: cause and effect, independent and dependent variables. So I have here experiments have, okay, variables. Experiments have what? Have variables, which are factors. Okay, we have here variables. Variables means what? Variables here factors that can vary. From its name, vary, change or change. Independent variable, the factor that researchers manipulate. Dependent variable, factor whose value depends on another one, or a change made to the independent variable. So let's have an example to see the difference between them. Experimental and control groups. We have here members of experimental group receive the treatment. Members of the experimental group, what happens with them? They receive the treatment. Okay. Members of a control do not. So the control group do not, but the members of the experiment will take the treatment. All other conditions are held constant for both the experimental group and the control group. A controlled experiment uses both a control group and an experiment group. So let's see together. The placebo effect. Placebo effect is the substance or treatment that has no effect at all apart from a person's life in its effect. Feeling better simply because we expect to feel better and far no other reason. Is an example of placebo effect. If I give you here, for example, if I give you a drug and I will a medicine, and I will tell you this medicine is for your headache, for example, but this medicine has no effect. I'm just saying that to make you feel better. So the placebo effect is a substance or treatment that has no effect apart from a person's belief in its effect. So you will feel that you'll get, some people feel that they got better by taking this placebo one, or this false medicine. In an experiment, what are variables? Variables here in the experiment means that factors that can vary or change. Let's have a single blind study. What's the single blind study? Here, the single blind study keeps participants unaware of the treatment they are receiving. Single blind, I'm doing here the experiment and you don't know, here you are unaware of the treatment. So it's like here the example that I gave you, that I will give you here medicine, and this medicine I say this is for your headache, but this is not for headaches, and you feel better after you took or you take this. So this is called single blind study. You as participants unaware of the treatment they are receiving. Participants do not know if they are in the experimental group or the control group. This is one way that researchers can avoid the influence of the expectation. Double-blind studies. A double-blind study is one in which both participants and researchers are unaware of who receives the treatment. So, double-blind studies help researchers avoid the influence of expectations and remain unbiased. So, I have here two groups. I will give them the right medicine and the other correct medicine, and the other I will give them the false medicine, and I'm not aware as a researcher of who will get the good one and who will get the deceived one. So this is called a double blind studies. Psychological methods, we have here the single blind and the double blind experiments, as you see, and we are gonna have case studies now. Single blind experiment, researcher aware but the participants unaware, experiment organizer aware. I have here the double blind experiment, unaware researcher, unaware participants, but of course the experiment organizer aware. In both single blind and double blind experiments, researchers must guard here against bias in favor of certain points of view by keeping participants unaware of their treatment. Okay, guys, I have here in both, we have here the participants on both are unaware. Who is aware of the treatment of treatment, the participants and the receiving. Here, what's the difference between single blind and double blind study? This is a good question, and we know here single blind participants do not know if they are in experimental or control group. Double blind, neither participants nor the experimenters know which participants are in the experimental and control group. Experimental and control group, I want to show you something before we go to the next step. The difference between the experimental group receive treatment, the real people that receive the treatment. Members and the control group, they do not take the treatment. Okay, this is important to remember, and I think now it's clear, right? Okay, guys, we have here what we have here. Central tendency and disposition. I'm talking about math again. Yes, statistics, a common technique used to generalize here data is to measure the central tendency. Remember, central tendency is the number that describes the average score of distribution. So this is kind of graph, yes, and it has here mean, median, and mode are ways of arriving at the central tendency. This means that the average score of distribution, the mean is the average score of distribution, median is the middle score, mode most frequent score, and this is we have taken this of course on the math section. Researchers use range and standard deviation to document here variability of a score. So we got a score, and we got here, we have to put our scores on a graph which is called here central tendency. Range is the difference between, we know, the lowest here score and the highest score. Standard deviation measure of distance of every score of the mean. So what's the relationship between standard deviation and the mean here? Standard deviation measure of distance every score to the mean. The mean is one way to measuring the average. And we have here, yes, we have math here. So we have here a graph, standard deviation bell curve graph. We have here scores in standard deviation. We have the mean here, and okay, and we have scores in standard deviation units. Okay. Ethical issues. What about ethical issues? Are standards for proper and responsible behavior. The American Psychological Association, APA, American Psychological Association, has established specific ethical guidelines that psychologists are required to follow. Research with people. Ethical standards limit the type of research psychologists here may conduct with people. Okay. A leading ethical principle is that study participants must not be harmed. So the participants must not be harmed by any way. Confidentially, we have here psychologists treat the records of research participants and clients are as confidential. So I can't, as a researcher, tell anybody about here the records. Only in certain cases may psychologists disregard the confidential. Informed here consent. The APA generally requires that people who volunteer to participate in the research studies provide informed consent. Informed consent means that people will agree or consent. Okay, so the informed consent means that the people agree on consent to participate in a research study only after they receive a general overview of the study and have been given the choice to whether or not to participate. Deception. Some psychological experiments, however, cannot be run without deceiving people. So, new drug experiments and other blind studies cannot be conducted without keeping participants unaware of the treatment or the nature of the study. Okay, not to be influenced by just thinking or imagining of the effects of the treatments. Psychologists follow APA guidelines when they must use deception. Informed consent. Participants in psychological studies must sign consent forms. What's the purpose of the consent form is very important. Psychologists follow strict ethical rules in how they produce, store, and present their data. They need to be objective as possible when conducting a study in order to avoid bias. They must be willing to discuss their hypothesis in the light of contradictory evidence collected in the research. Doing otherwise would be misleading and thus unethical. Here we have here a question: why is confidentiality so important in psychology? Respect the individual's privacy. Help ensure true information, honest answers. So we have here resolving ethical issues. The American Psychological Association, APA, has a detailed statement of principles, guys, and code of conduct. The principles are divided into 10 major categories. Listed below are 8 ways to resolve your ethical issues from the first category on ethical standards. For the complete ethical principles of psychologists, a code of conduct, see the reference section. And we have here, this is here the code of the ethical issues. We have here misuse of work. Psychologists take reasonable steps to correct misuse of their work. Legal and ethical conflicts. Psychologists take steps to resolve conflicts between professional ethical responsibilities on the one hand and the official laws on the other hand. Ethical conflicts with organization. Psychologists also clarify any conflict between the APA ethics code and the demands of the other organization. And we have here informal resolution of violation. Here psychologists attempt to resolve an ethical violation by another psychologist by first bringing it to the attention of the person in attempt to informally here resolve the problem. Reporting violation. Psychologists take further action if an ethical violation here has harmed or is likely to harm a person or organization. Cooperation. Psychologists cooperate in ethics investigation. Complaints. Psychologists do not file or encourage the filing of reckless ethics complaints. Unfair discrimination. Here psychologists do not deny others professional advancement based solely upon their having been the subject of an ethic complaint if the complaint is unjustified and unsubstantiated. Research with animals. Most psychological studies that use animals do not harm the animals. This is very important, okay? Because animals are also souls, so we can't harm any soul. Sometimes psychologists and other scientists Conduct research that may be harmful to animals. Such studies often use animals because they cannot be carried on out with people or for ethical reasons. Psychologists use animals only when there is no alternative, guys, and when they believe that the benefit overweights the harm. Only a small number of psychological studies involve animals. Many people, however, believe that is no more ethical to harm animals than it's to harm people. The APA has rules of ethics for how animals used in research should be treated. Why are rules needed to the treatment of animals in experiments? To ensure that the ethical guys treatment to ensure ethical treatments also for the animals. Applying what you have learned, the hypothetical snack bar among students at our school are stated here. Preferences for cola soft drinks and tortilla chips consistent with preferences with these items are taste tested. Introduction. The premise here of the experiment is to conduct a double-blind taste test study. Began by recording favorite soda flavors and favorite tortilla chip flavors. Then, how to conduct here the cola experiment? Use the shield between the subject and the tester. Use the blindfold for the subject. Have the subject test 3 cup. Subject here, the person, the individual. Have the subject here test 3 cups of soda poured by assistants who know which soda is in which cup. So after that, how to conduct the tortilla chip experiment? Use a shield also between the subject and the tester. Use a blindfold for the subject. Follow the same steps with the tortilla as the cola. Use the same brand of chips but 3 different flavors. The subject tests 3 serving of chips by assistants who have recorded which chips are in the bowl. So the discussion was the hypothesis here proved or disproved. Which subject matter that you studied in this chapter was touched on these experiments? What did you learn from this experiment? Okay, guys, I have the scientific method here as we see the steps, and then we got to that here. Thank you for listening, my dear students. That was all the quarters lessons. So I hope you to understand everything. If you have any question, please send me on the SCL. Bye bye.